Exactly 11:30 on TRE Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. It's now 100 years since drugs were first banned. On the eve of this centenary, journalist Johann Hari set off on an epic 3-year, 30,000-mile journey into the war on drugs to uncover the secret, and found there's a rather startling gap between what we've been told and what is really going on. In his new book, Chasing the Scream, he gives an account of how drugs are not what we've been told they are, addiction is not what we think it is, and the drug war has very different motives to the ones we have seen on our TV screens. I'm delighted to welcome Johann to the programme. Good morning, sir.
It's great to be with you, and I'm so glad to have Joni Mitchell as my opening act.
Did you like that as a warm-up?
Exactly.
Cost me a lot of money to get her to do the warm-up for you, you know that, don't you? Now, to simplify what I think you're saying is all we've got to do is legalise drugs, adults will then switch to softer drugs, drugs will become boring, the war is won.
No. That's not what I'm saying. Actually, one of the things I think is a problem in the way we talk and think about this whole issue is we talk in big, grand, abstract arguments. Sometimes it's the one you just gave. Sometimes it's the one, drugs, we need to go to war against drugs. I didn't want to think in either of those terms. What I wanted to do was to tell the stories of people whose lives have been changed by this policy one way or another, and people whose lives have been changed by choosing the alternatives. And so I think the way we need to think about this is not to talk in these grand abstractions. We need to sit with the people whose lives are changed by it and talk about them. Now, that was a really big range of people. It went from the story of Billie Holiday, who was stalked and killed by the founder of the war on drugs. I talked to her surviving friends about that, stories in the book. I talked to, over 3 years, I got to know a transsexual crack dealer in Brooklyn, his story, or the only hitman to ever be at the center of the worst Mexican drug cartel and make it out to tell his story, or the story of a homeless drug addict in Vancouver who started an uprising that completely changed the country. I think if we want to understand this, we need to sit with real people and listen to them and not talk in these airy kind of fancy abstractions. That's where we'll find the answers.
I think that's a fair comment. One of your earliest memories, as far as I'm aware, was trying to rouse a relative from a drug-induced stupor, and you have experience of somebody who's been a crack and a heroin addict.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to... these things are always difficult to talk about in public, aren't they? But
yeah.
We had addiction at the heart of my family, and I think... And I also had a relationship with someone who had a bad drug problem, and I guess what I wanted to know, there were lots of questions I wanted to answer, because I kind of felt like I'd been given answers by my teachers and my government
yes.
that clearly weren't right. So I guess I wanted to know, when did we start treating addicts like this and drug users? Why do we carry on doing it? What are the alternatives? Is there a better way to do this? And I was really struck on this big, long journey the last quarter of the book is about the places that have chosen to stop fighting the drug war, and I think this is really relevant, particularly to your audience.
Absolutely.
15 years ago, Portugal decided to decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack. And I think the story of how and why that happened, I tell it through the story of the amazing Dr. João Goulão, who led this, an extraordinary, really extraordinary man. But by the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is mind-blowing, right? And they had been trying the American way. They had been trying, punish the addicts severely, have a drug war, ratchet it up, put more and more people in prison. They tried all that. And every time they tried it, the problem got worse. So they did something that no other government has been brave enough to do, and it's really interesting how they did it, actually. The main political parties got together and said, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to set up a commission of just doctors and scientists and judges. We're going to send them away, and we're all going to agree in advance that whatever they recommend, we're going to do. So they took it out of politics. I don't think, to be honest, they thought they'd come back and be so radical. But, okay, they did it.
Yep.
So they come back, and they said, let's decriminalise everything. Now, that sounds shocking. I was kind of shocked. But what they recommended next is really important. They said, let's take all the money that we currently spend on arresting drug users, trying drug users, imprisoning drug users. Let's take all that money and do two other things instead. So we'll transfer the resources. The first thing is really honest drug education for teenagers. Really, I sat in on those lessons. They are blunt and they are honest, and they are about empowering kids to resist, right? And the second is really good support for drug addicts. So at the moment, the model in Britain and America is we cut addicts off, right? What we do is we say if we find someone who's an addict, we make it much harder for them to get a job by giving a criminal record. We put them in a prison. We do all sorts of things. The Portuguese said we're going to do completely the opposite. We're going to do everything we can to reconnect addicts with society. We're going to give them subsidised jobs. We're going to pay people to take them on. We're going to give them small loans to start companies. We're going to do everything we can to get them a normal life. And it's now been 15 years, and the results are in. Addiction is down. Injecting drug use has fallen by 50%. That's 50%. Overdose is dramatically down. And all the other things that people were worried about, totally rightly, teenage drug use has stayed the same. Actually, one of the most moving interviews I did of the hundreds of people I spoke to for the book was with a guy called João Figueira, who was he's the top drug cop in Portugal.
Yes.
And he was the leader of the opposition to this for completely understandable reasons. He was worried that there'd be a massive explosion of drug use and everything that a lot of your listeners will be worried about. And it was so moving, the exact quotes are in the book, but he said, everything I said would happen didn't happen. Everything the other side said would happen did happen. And not only do I hope the whole world does this, but I actually regret that I spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users because it was, a disaster.
Good Lord.
And I think the thing about Portugal has a very competitive political system. There's a lot of parties, and almost no one wants to go back. And that really struck me. And, to go from that, I went there towards the end, to seeing the real disasters this drug war causes. Whether it's I went out to a prison in Arizona where the women are forced to go out on chain gangs, wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict, to see what was done to Billie Holiday, the kind of heartbreaking story of the killing of Billie Holiday that opens the book, to go to Mexico, Ciudad Juarez, at that time one of the deadliest cities in the world, and to see all these tragedies, and then to, at the end, see it doesn't have to be this way. If I'm completely honest, I actually put off going to Portugal because there was a little bit of me that thought, what if I go there and it doesn't work? Then it's just going to be a really depressing book. But it so exceeded my expectations of what what's happening, that there's a totally different way of doing this that's based on acknowledging some basic truths. 90% of the people who use drugs are not harmed by them, illegal drugs, right? That's not my figure, that's not coming from some liberal group. That's the UN Office of Drug Control, who are the kind of people who coordinate the global drug war. Even they admit that, right? And if you think about your life, that seemed very shocking to me, but if you think about your life, think about the people who drink alcohol. 90% of them will go for a beer. They don't become, they don't become alcoholics. They don't develop problems. Doesn't diminish the tragedy of the 10% for a second. But so partly it's about saying the 90% who aren't harmed don't, we just need to give them health advice and that's that. The 10% who are harmed, they don't need punishment and cruelty. They need love and support. That's what all of us want for our relatives when they become addicts. And that's what we should do together as a culture, I think. And I try to talk about in the book about how that could be.
It's stories about people, as you rightly say. Let's talk about a very interesting part in the book, which was about an experiment which kind of changed the way people thought about drugs, or people who knew what they were talking about. They used to do experiments on rats in the 70s, and they basically took the results of that and decided that if they gave a rat a choice between pure water and water laced with heroin, the rats would become addicted to the opiate and kept taking the drug until it killed them, until somebody...
There's a slightly different way of explaining it. So there's basically, if you'd said to me 4 years ago, what causes drug addiction, right? It would have seemed to me like a stupid question. Obviously, drugs cause drug addiction, right? You think that you and me, if the next 20 people who walk past your window, if the 22 of us all used heroin for 20 days, on day 21 we'd all be heroin addicts because there's chemical hooks in heroin that make you physically dependent on them, and that's what addiction is, right? That's what I thought. Yeah. The first crack in thinking about that was when someone explained to me, if you, God forbid, step out of your studio today and you're hit by a car and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and then be given diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much more powerful heroin than the heroin you would score on the streets because it's pure, and obviously criminals don't sell you pure stuff. You'd be given that for quite a long time. In every hospital everywhere in the developed world, loads of people are being given heroin all the time. And if the old theory about addiction was right, when it's cut off, they would go and score on the streets, or they would be in a terrible state. Actually, they just stop. They just go back to their lives. So when I heard that, I thought, and I looked at all the studies, and it's true. I mean, that's just an indisputable fact. That's what led me to Professor Bruce Alexander in Vancouver, whose story I tell in Chasing the Scream, which is just he's a fascinating man. So long before the 70s, there had been a series of rat experiments. They're really simple. People could do them at home, although I would recommend not doing it. You get a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. Mm-hmm. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and will almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, that's addiction, fine. Mm. In the 70s, Bruce comes along and says, well, hang on a minute. We're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing else to do. Let's try this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park, which is like heaven for rats, right? It's everything your rat about town could want. It's got loads of friends. It's got loads of coloured balls. It's got loads of cheese. Actually, I don't think it was cheese. It was some kind of food they liked.
Yeah.
And they've got both the water bottles. They've got the drugged water and the normal water. Now, bear in mind, when they're alone, they drink the drugged water until they kill themselves. In Rat Park, turns out the rats didn't like the drugs. They all tried them because they didn't know what they were. They drank very small amounts, and none of them ever overdosed. So bear in mind, almost all of them did previously. None of them did in Rat Park. And what Bruce says is, and there's loads of ways he developed this and shows how it applies to humans, what Bruce said is, this shows us that both the left-wing theory and the right-wing theory of drug addiction is wrong. The right-wing theory is people party too hard, they indulge themselves, they get accidentally hooked, and, it's a moral failing, right? This shows that's not right. Also shows the left-wing theory, which is the drugs hijack your brain, they take you over, you've then got a disease, addiction is a disease. That's not right either. Bruce says addiction isn't a moral failing, addiction isn't a disease, addiction is an adaptation to your environment. It happens to anyone who is deeply cut off and isolated. Now, there are different ways in which you can be cut off and isolated. You can be Elton John, who is one of the people who endorsed this book, and a rock star, and if you're cut off from normal life as a rock star, as one guy, Peter Cohen, puts it, is an addiction expert, says, human beings have an innate need to bond, and if we can't bond with each other, we'll bond with something else that gives us pleasure, whether it's cocaine or a roulette wheel or sex. We will return obsessively to the thing that gives us a bond. And he actually says we should stop using the word addiction and use the word bonding, which I think is quite interesting. There's a good, I'm conscious that I'm giving a lot of answers, but there's a human example of the Rat Park experiment that I think is worth mentioning. During the Vietnam War, 20% of all the American soldiers were using heroin, right? And there was completely understandably a real panic in the United States because they thought, oh, God, when the war's over, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States. Actually, all the evidence is, and there were studies of this, they just came home and stopped. Because if you're taken out of a hellish, pestilential jungle where you might die at any moment, you don't want to be there, and you go back to your nice home in Wichita, Kansas with your friends and your normal life and your job, you don't want to be out of your head all the time. So I think it shows us that we need to think about, what I learned from this is we need to think about drugs differently. The drug addiction is not the earthquake. The drug addiction is one of the aftershocks. Now, an aftershock can be bad. It can bring the building down. I'm not diminishing the aftershock. But a person who has a healthy and connected life doesn't want to use drugs all the time. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
What did you discover, if anything, about people who are addicted to prescription drugs, for example, antidepressants?
I was addicted to antidepressants for a long time, and I'm very sympathetic to this. It's similar to other things. The way out of any addiction is by connecting with the people around you and loving the people around you and you loving them back and having meaning and purpose in life. And I think the prescription drugs show us all sorts of things about the drug war. One is, imagine if tomorrow antidepressants were made illegal, right? Mm-hmm. They were criminalized. What would happen? It's exactly what happens with other drugs, which I saw, on the front lines in Brownsville, Brooklyn, with a transsexual former crack dealer. When you ban something, you transfer it to armed criminal gangs. Those armed criminal gangs use violence to establish their reputation. If someone if you run a store selling beer and I come into your store and steal it, you just ring the police and the police will come and take me away, right? Mm-hmm. If you're selling cannabis or ecstasy or cocaine, obviously you can't ring the police and say, I'm a drug dealer, someone's taken my drugs. So you have to either fight back, or what you want to do is preemptively say, no one should mess with me. So you establish a reputation for being terrifying by enacting all sorts of violence. That's what would happen with prescription drugs. Now, there are problems related to prescription drugs, all sorts of problems as I've known in my own life, but they would only be much bigger if we did what we've done with these drugs and criminalised them. And I saw, there's a guy called Charles Bowden who said, the war on drugs creates a war for drugs among criminals. And that's really what I saw. There will be people living with drug dealers fighting in Spain. It happens in London. A huge number of the stabbings in London are, gangs fighting each other.
Yeah.
When you see that in a place like Ciudad Juarez, it's just mind-blowing.
I put you in charge. I kick David Cameron out just for a week or so and say to you, get on with solving the UK's drug problem, Johann. What's the first thing you do?
Different places need different solutions, and in a way, we need to experiment. So we've tried one way for 100 years, right? No one can say we didn't give it a fair shot. We've tried one way for 100 years. Now, what I would advise, and I would say we should be extremely cautious, we should experiment, we should be humble, we should watch the results very carefully, and if things go wrong, we need to try other ways. What I would recommend cautiously is we don't need to talk, again, I want to get away from talking in hypotheticals, right?
Yeah.
We need to look at the places which are already doing this and where it works, okay? And we need to learn from them. So, and actually the forms of, what we have at the moment is a system of people getting drugs, the currently banned drugs, which is totally unregulated. Unknown criminals sell unknown chemicals to unknown users. What we need to do is bring that chaos and anarchy into a web of regulation. And we've already got the web of regulation. Think about alcohol, right? We have a strong regulated model. Think about antidepressants, which you mentioned. We have a regulated model that is different. You can't go into this, I don't know enough about the situation in Spain, but I'm pretty sure you can't just go into the pharmacy and buy antidepressants. You go to your doctor. That's what we need to do with these drugs. So what I would say is with cannabis, we need to do what they've done in Washington and Colorado and Uruguay, especially Uruguay, where I interviewed the president, who's the most incredible man. But which is you sell it like alcohol. Strict regulation, very strict punishment for people who sell to children or teenagers, and licensed regulated sale. With some other drugs, I would have another model of licensing, maybe ecstasy, you would have licensed nightclubs. With a drug like heroin, again, we don't need to talk hypothetically. This was done in Britain. It's really fascinating. I tell the story in Chasing the Scream of a guy called Dr. John Marks, who just such an interesting guy. He was a doctor who arrived in Liverpool in Widnes, just outside Liverpool, in 1982, and was really baffled to be a GP, and he was baffled to discover that there were people being prescribed heroin in his clinic. He was like, what is this? And there was a kind of loophole that left over from the 20s that some addicts were just prescribed heroin. He thought this was a really bad idea, and he's brought them in to interview them to kind of say, we've got to stop this. And what he noticed is these heroin addicts were nothing like any heroin addicts he'd ever come across. They all had jobs. None of them had abscesses or wounds. They had kind of normal lives. They were somewhat sedate. Heroin addiction is not a trivial thing, but they were just nothing like the heroin addicts he'd known. The more he learned about it, the more he learned that a huge number of the problems, not all by any means, but a huge number of the problems that we associate with heroin addiction are in fact problems caused by banning heroin addiction. Wounds and abscesses and people losing limbs, that's all due to the fact the drug is contaminated. That doesn't happen with heroin. It never happens to people who use diamorphine in hospital. So what he did is he expanded that program, and the results were incredible. There was a 93% fall in burglary. The police were the biggest champions of it. Marks and Spencer's wanted to sponsor a conference for everyone to do it because their shoplifting rates fell so far. And John went to the United States to promote this, and the American government went crazy and pressured the British government and said, shut this damn thing down. And it was shut down. And although John, for 13 years, had been prescribing and none of his patients had died, in the 2 years after, more than 40 of them died, loads had horrible injuries, loads went back to prostitution, to burglary. The burglary rate went back to what it was. The alternatives have been tried. So with something like heroin, you would have prescription by doctors. Now, there's obviously a very difficult layer, which are things like methamphetamine and crack. And there's a range of views on that. Some people think you should just keep them banned, and I respect those people who think that. Some people think you should have safe, regulated spaces where people can go in, use them in that space and not leave. So there's something like that in Vancouver where you have, which I went to, we have like injecting rooms where you can use heroin. It would be like an adaptation of that. we need to experiment, because the thing we know for sure is what we've been doing ain't working.
Fascinating stuff. The book, as you say, is called Chasing the Screen. Before you go, Johann, I must just ask you, I am aware that you are involved producing Russell Brand's podcast and YouTube channel. That must be a hoot.
Oh, I love working with Russell. I mean, actually, I'm not doing that much of it at the moment, but because partly because I'm doing book promotion, I've started my next book. But, you know, I should just say as well, shameless plug, that the book's website is www.chasingthescream.com. But with Russell, Russell's a great example. Russell was an addict. Russell was treated with love and care and respect. He got better, and now he's making a great contribution to Britain and British public life. Lots of the people who endorsed the book, Elton John, you know, who wrote an amazing thing about the book. You know, does anyone think Elton and Russell would be better off if they'd been put in some cage for 2 years, some stone cell, that would have meant them, and then they'd not been able to get jobs when they got out? They'd been, you know, I think pretty much everyone can see, even if you don't give a damn about drug users and drug addicts, and I understand lots of people don't, what a waste of your money, what a waste of your taxes to use all this money on something that doesn't work, when Portugal has shown you can use that money for something that actually really does reduce drug addiction.
It's been very interesting to talk to you, Johann. I appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
One more plug for you, Chasing the Scream, and thank you. We'll get you on again at some point in the future.
Fantastic, thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.